Hello, everyone. So I am going to start our first episode of Pages to Progress. If you don't know what this is, I want to encourage you to jump on board this. You can buy the book to join with this, I don't know, a series initiative that we're doing. This is a book by James Cone. He's a theologian, and he specifically talks on issues around the black struggle. So what I'm going to attempt to do, and this is just going to be an attempt, for those of you who have joined me on the journey of my readathon, if you were, we're going to be picking a chapter a week to get through the entire book, and we're going to share thoughts, ideas, see where God leads us on this journey. Each week we'll be covering a new chapter until we finish the book. Then we pick another book, which I'm open to your suggestions as we grow together. So the job of from last week to this week, we were supposed to read chapter 1, which kind of is the introduction and chapter 1. I'm going to share a few of my thoughts from my reading. Page 18 of the introduction, it says, the cross helped me, Cone is talking, the cross helped me to deal with the brutal legacy of the lynching tree. And the lynching tree helped me to understand the tragic meaning of the cross. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar, the lynching tree is a symbol for what the black struggle had to try and deal with. It's how white supremacy basically tied a noose around their necks and hung them from the trees all across America. And so this book is designed to try and offer perspective to that symbol and try to tie in a link between the biblical idea of what the cross symbolizes. This is what Cone says. The cross, this is on page 2, the cross is the cross is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. I found this book incredible because for such a morbid, difficult, challenging subject, for a subject that almost seemed devoid of hope, Cone really extracts the beauty and the power of the paradoxical symbol of what a lynching tree could symbolize in comparison to what a cross could also symbolize. Not could, but does symbolize. And this is something that was really challenging to me as he makes these connections all throughout the chapter. He says, at no time was the struggle to keep such hope alive more difficult than during the lynching era, 1880 to 1940. It's a difficult read, I'm not going to lie. In the first chapter, he talks about the history of the lynching tree, where it came from. I didn't actually know that lynching was not directly initiated first, primarily against the blacks, but it was something almost glorified for all those who had a crime. And it was only after post kind of Reconstruction era, after the Emancipation Act, after slavery was so-called banned at that time, that the lynching tree took on a new identity where it sought to criminalize specifically black people and basically dehumanize them. So lynching was not regarded as an evil, but as a necessity. So actually, within initial society, the lynching tree was actually something which changed in its identity over time until now, as we know it, as something which is heinous and awful towards the black community. There was Cone brings out something really interesting about a film that was published in 1915 called The Birth of a Nation. It's a pretty horrible white supremacist movie that actually even President Woodrow Wilson endorsed, which kind of, how can I put this? It supports the notion that black people were essentially criminals and worthy of that kind of dehumanization. And it was quite a difficult read to even see the nature of what this movie can do. There's a movie that came out a while ago. Oh, it was The Exorcist. That was it. And I remember, I didn't watch it, but I know the nature of what happened with The Exorcist as it was released. When The Exorcist was released, it was so horrible. I believe that it inspired, unfortunately, some shootings and some killings to take place as a result of that. This same phenomenon took place when this movie, The Birth of a Nation, was released in 1915, and unfortunately, it actually inspired a white man in Kentucky who left the theater so excited that he shot and killed a 15-year-old African American high school student. I guess this really brings out the nature of what a narrative of dehumanization to the black community can do, that has all these repercussions that will affect the whole of human society. And that really pointed me to the realization of how supremacy really has its power in trying to change narratives, glorify violent narratives, glorify racist narratives, so that people can feel empowered to dehumanize others. Cone continues to go through chapter 1, talking about the struggle in the Civil War, as the Confederacy was being, I guess, phased out of society through military action. It made it difficult for black people to be able to struggle. And one of the things that was taking place in those early periods, which I'm learning as someone new to this country, is the white supremacists needed a way to continue to oppress black people, but unfortunately slavery had been done away with, so they used other methods. And one of the other systemic methods that they use is change the image directly of black men and black women. I'm going to read you another quote on page 6. The image of black men was transformed from docile slaves and harmless sambos to menacing black beast rapists. The most serious threat to the virtue of the white woman and the sanctity of the white home. The image of a black woman was changed from nurturing Negro mammies to salacious Jezebels, nearly as corrupt into white civilizations as black men. This kind of really pulled my heart in a lot of pain to realize the power of narratives. I grew up in England with a phrase, I don't know if this is here in America: sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. It's such a fallacy to even think that names do not have the power to crumble and destroy humanity on so many different levels. And this is part of the systemization of racism that came into effect in almost, I want to call it subtle, but it's not subtle. It was open and obvious. But I guess what I want to say is, because it was just words, it could be assumed that this isn't actually oppression. And at the time, it probably wasn't assumed or even accepted to be a form of oppression, because words never really had that power back then. But as true as we can reflect on these kind of things, even now, it is more than safe to conclude how words can crumble a nation over time. So conclusively, words have the most powerful effect to shape and transform humanity's identity. And this is so true as we look at, even in scripture, in the contrast of what God wants to try and affirm to us as human beings using words. This is why the word is divine. The Bible is divine. This isn't just black ink on a white page. No, this is actually word that brings life. But the same word, the same characters that can be used to build up are the same characters can be used to destroy. Not in a moment, not in an instant. Yes, obviously they can hurt in an instant, but words have the power to dehumanize and completely destroy a nation of people over years and years and years and years. So Cone goes on to talk about the nature of how blacks lived in fear in those lynching period times, where every single little step, unfortunately, was so significant. A quote on page 9: blacks had to watch their step no matter where they were in America. A black man could be walking down the road, minding his business, and his life could suddenly change by meeting a white man or a group of white men or boys who on a whim decided to have some fun with a Negro. And this could happen in Mississippi or New York or Arkansas or Illinois. Do you know, when I read this, it hit me hard, because James Cone is talking about an era in the, the 1870s or something like that. 1880 to 1940. That's basically the lynching era that he coins in there. And when he writes about that, and when I read that quote, I was like, hang on a minute. This doesn't actually sound like that time. Of course, yes, it is that time. But this actually sounds like the here and now, when we hear of all the difficulties that take place with police brutality against black people. These are black people just minding their own business. These are black people who are simply just existing. And it just shows that the oppression of black people has not come to an end. And this is even more reason why reading around this subject right now and being engaged in the black struggle right now is so crucial to understanding not just how we can highlight these things are happening, but what we as a church and what God requires of us as Christians to do in the face of such tragedy. He also talks about the difficulties for black people to try and respond to what was taking place with not just the lynching, but how they were treated in many different ways, how they literally had to be very careful because any little thing could get them in trouble. Page 12, should a black man in the South lift his hand or raise his voice to reprimand a white person, he would incur the full weight of the law and the mob. Even to look at white people in a manner regarded as disrespectful could get a black lynched. This really talks about the difficult terrain black people had to walk at those times where they couldn't even speak up to defend themselves. I engage with a lot of people around race relations and stuff like this, and sometimes I'm shocked at the remarks of what some people would say in relation to this topic of, oh, just get over it, this is something that happened in the past, or things like, oh, it's so exhausting to hear people constantly talk about this. And then I'm reminded when I read about this of the years and decades where black people couldn't speak. And now we have this small segment in history where not just black people, but people are speaking about it. I almost feel like it's unfair for us as a humanity to silence the voice that has been silenced for centuries. Something interesting that Cone continues to go on, he talks about how black people tried to cope within the struggle. And he talks about the birth of blues music. And it was really interesting how he coined some of this. I'm going to read to you another quote on page 12. How did Southern rural blacks survive the terrors of this era? Self-defense and protest were out of the question, but there were other forms of resistance. Excuse me. For blacks, it was the blues and religion that offered the chief weapons of resistance. At the juke joints on Friday and Saturday nights, and the churches on Sunday mornings and evening weeknights, black affirmed their humanity and fought back against dehumanization. It was really fascinating to just dive into the world of what music and being in a space of Christianity and religion did for them. Hope in the black possibility on page 15 in a dream of a new world had to be carved out of wretched conditions, out of a world where the possibility of violent death was always imminent. This is the essence, or I guess the terrain of what allowed black people to use the blues to express themselves where they could not even express themselves. This is why I grew up in a black church. It's known that black churches tend to be more expressive and vibrant and rich in their worship experiences, with an interactive kind of culture that exists in worship spaces, because it was the one place where a semblance of freedom, where freedom did actually exist, at least on a spiritual level, and even in some of these juke places as well, juke joints as well, where black people could be able to be themselves without a fear of saying something out of place. This is why these are some of the most sacred spaces that black people have continued to enjoy over the centuries. Even today, this is why blues music is still at the very fabric of modern day expression of music that has influenced so much over the history. I find it fascinating to really look at that. Something else that I want to bring out as well is Black Pride. You may have heard it before, about the power of being black, or the pride of being black, which is something so sacred in and of itself. I'll read to you a quote on page 17. When an adult black male is treated like a child in a patriarchal society where whites are calling him boy, and there's other racial slurs which kind of make him boyish, proclaiming oneself a man is a bold and necessary affirmation of black resistance. And Cone here is referring to some of the Negro spirituals and some of the blues songs where black people would affirm themselves as man. And he actually quotes a song, Rock Me Baby, where the actual lyrics is man, and then the spelling of man, M-A-N, to offer emphasis. This, in essence, or this emphasis that black people used to affirm their identity, it humanized themselves, and it allowed them to be reminded of their value. And this is where I can really see is the essence of why Black Pride was a part of what is necessary in the struggle. And seeing how blues music kind of walked them through that was fascinating. And so Cone continues to make the connection now between the church and blues music, and this is quite interesting. I really want you to catch this. If the blues offered an affirmation of humanity, religion offered a way for black people to find hope. Our churches were where we dip our tired bodies in cool springs of hope, wrote Richard Wright in 12 Million Voices, where we retain our wholeness and humanity despite the blows of death. This was big for me, huge. I guess it really highlighted to me, folks, this is our responsibility as a church, to provide cool springs of hope. Today, you may look at the rest of society and realize that there is not much hope available in the eyes of most people. If a church is not engaged, if the people are not engaged in providing hope to a hopeless generation, then I would propose that we're probably not being a church. We're not following the mandate of God's will. And I mean that in two prongs. One, in the prong of a cerebral, spiritual level of providing a hope in Jesus, but the second in providing a physical hope in offering action towards social justice. The final word about Black Death, page 23. The final word about Black Death, about Black life is not death on a lynching tree, but redemption in the cross, a miraculously transformed life found in the God of the gallows. This faith empowers blacks to wrestle with trouble as Jacob wrestled with his divine opponent till daybreak, refusing to let go until he was blessed with meaning and purpose. This was massive for me. I love this. I know the screen. There's an old Negro spiritual, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder, and there are others as well, Wake Up Jacob. But if you know any of those Negro spirituals, it's incredibly emotional and powerful. And actually there are two versions to the Negro spiritual, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. One version basically says, let me get this right. Hold on. No, I'm mixing up with another Negro spiritual. Let me say this about Jacob's Ladder, about the story of Jacob and why the blacks really just connected with that story. Cone says, although Jacob was left with a limp, he won his struggle with God. This is incredibly powerful to an oppressed people who can physically see the limps in their lives and yet can find a source of hope that helps them to charter paths of God's emancipation of a nation. And I thought that was pretty mad. Cone admits to the same reality that I admit, that it's crazy and mad to find hope in the place where black people struggled so much in their pain. Miraculous, to say the least. In the same way, Cone writes in page 20, on page 25, it's crazy to find salvation in the cross, victory in defeat, and life in death. This is why the meaning of the cross is intensely debated today, especially by secular and religious intellectuals who reject the absurd idea that a shameful, despicable death could reveal anything. And I probably need to end quite here, and I'll leave you with a couple of other things before I close this. Unlike page 28, unlike the spirituals and the church, the blues and the juke joint did not lead to an organized political resistance against white supremacy. But one could say that the spirituals and the church, and here's where the exciting bit is, that the spirituals and the church, with Jesus's cross at the heart of its faith, gave birth to the Black freedom movement that reached its peak in the civil rights era during the 1950s and the 60s. Folks, this chapter 1 challenged me so much. And I'll say this. The birth of freedom, or at least the mandate of freedom, needs to be led by God's people. If it isn't, then I wonder if those people are actually God's people. Not just the Bible, where God used so many different nations to charter a path for emancipation, for freedom. It's clear to me in the Black struggle, over the past 400 years of slavery, whatever you want to call it, God has a job for this church to do. And I guess the prayer that I have is that God really opens our eyes to know what's our part to play. Here we are in Kirkland. Here we are in Washington State. Here we are right now where racial injustice is being highlighted. Join me in your private prayers as I pray to God, asking, what is it you would like us to do right now and right here? This has been a quick summary on our new project, Pages to Progress. I want to encourage you to buy the book and join us on the journey as we read together James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Next week, Wednesday, we will have another video that will be released. I'm going to try and keep it consistent. All right, let me do this. I'm going to promise to release a video every week at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, where we look at chapter 2. I want to invite you also to engage with me. If there is something that you want to add and comment to, feel free to text me, to call me. Feel free to comment on the YouTube video or on the social media pages that this video is going to be posted on, as we grow together, moving from pages to progress. May God bless you.